All eyes are on Rwanda as we warm up towards the African chapter of the World Economic Forum, dubbed WEF Africa 2016. Well, there have been many questions about Rwanda's preparedness to the forum, and those questions seem to have been answered. Well, we'll give you just 2 days, and then we'll know how Rwanda has prepared for the forum. Today, the special edition of the Big Q. I am happy to be joined by the Hauser Senior Fellow, also the former President of the African Development Bank, Dr. Donald Kaberuka, and we're going to talk on a few issues. One of them is what World Economic Forum is going to be looking at, and compassing especially on the theme connecting Africa's resources through digital transformation. We're also going to highlight some of the issues seeking to identify priorities and actions for African leaders so they can build resilient economies, especially for today's challenges. Join me shortly. A warm welcome once again to the Big Q with me, Ime Mulekatete Kalema, and I'm gladly to be joined by Dr. Donald Kaberuka. A warm welcome to the special edition of the Big Q.
Thank you so much.
The World Economic Forum, what does it mean to Africa, later on to Rwanda?
First of all, let me begin by thanking you for inviting me.
Pleasure.
And for the way you are highlighting the role Rwanda is playing in this World Economic Forum. I mean, congratulations to the government, people of Rwanda for this. You know, the World Economic Forum has a long history, but fundamentally it is a forum where you bring people who have solutions. So business, philanthropists, academia, civil society, to deal with an issue of the day. Now, over time, Davos, which is a global meeting point, has provided forum. But it is obvious that each continent is different. So there's West Africa, there's Asia, Latin America, and so on. And for this particular moment, I'm very excited by what I'm seeing here in Rwanda. I think it is the right place to be having the forum at this point. And I expect that the outcome will be quite a convincing one.
We also expect a lot from it. But when you look at the people of Rwanda, what are some of the meaningful and tangible results that we should look up to? You have attended many World Economic Forums. Maybe I cannot even be able to count. But what are some of the meaningful, tangible yields that we should expect from the conference?
You know, let me give you an example which I like to give for people who are skeptical about some of these gatherings. I don't know how much you're familiar with the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization.
Yes, Gavi.
Gavi was born inside the World Economic Forum. So the need was identified to extend vaccination to millions or more children who did not have that possibility.
Sure.
And so at Davos, businesses, which means pharmaceutical companies and governments and philanthropy, the like of Bill Gates, came together, created an alliance, which alliance now has enabled many more children to be vaccinated. Sure. So this is one example on the philanthropic side. But let me give you something else which you'll be familiar with, the Global Competitiveness Index.
Yes.
At which Rwanda scores quite well, by the way.
Yep.
It is an index which provides a good metric of how every country is doing in terms of competitiveness.
Yes. And
like its cousin, they're doing business shows. This kind of information is valued, it's absolutely important. And I do believe that coming out of this conference, people will be able to see what is happening in Africa, in Rwanda. People will be able to see that the perception they have of the continent and the reality of the continent is quite different. Yep. We still have challenges, but as we'll be able to see a lot of progress being made as well.
Doctor, don't blame the skepticism from most of the people. It's because we've had all these mega conferences before, and they seem to adopt such beautiful resolutions. They have very good English, but they seem to stay on paper. It's not the first time that a World Economic Forum on Africa is held in Africa. Now, looking at one that was held maybe in Nigeria, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Tanzania, what are some of the tangible results that have been born out of those forums in particular?
I don't want to link the forum and the flow of investment.
Okay.
But I've watched the flow of FDI in Africa in the last 10 years, now which has reached levels which outstrip foreign aid and has been increasing even when you have all this skepticism about the continent.
Yep.
So I have reason to believe that while you are welcome to continue questioning the need of some of these big conferences and saying, look, we need tangible outcomes. But often tangible outcomes don't come the next day. It is a process. And I do believe that the better we understand Africa, the more investment will be flowing in countries like Rwanda, the region, and the continent as a whole.
Very good. In my introduction, I talked about the theme of the World Economic Forum being connecting Africa's resources through digital transformation. Do you think this theme is realistic, especially looking at the fact that 20% only of African populace is connected to internet? But
precisely, that is the whole point. We have reached a point now in the global economy where it is what you know, it is talent, it is information you have, which now has more value than anything else, including capital.
Yep.
And so, at a meeting like this, to be able to identify the gaps in policies, in infrastructure, in connectivity, what does it take for us to go from extractives to learning economies? What does it take for us to be able to increase the pool of talent, which is needed at this point in time? So precisely because of the problem you were mentioning, a conference like this is timely.
Very good. But we seem to have many other lingering challenges. Africa is no longer that poverty-stricken Pandora of yesteryears. We have moved somewhere. However, we still have issues like insecurities. We still have inequality in Africa. Aren't those some of the things that we are supposed to be tackling right now?
Okay, let me look at the glass which is half full.
Okay.
I do believe that if you look at the year 2000 and now, the size of the African economy has multiplied 5 times.
Okay.
In many countries, poverty has been declining, not increasing. Africa is not getting poorer as it was in the 1990s.
Very sure.
So, because of demographics, because of the global situation, there are still problems to tackle. But I do believe that anyone looking at Africa of the year 2000 and today is a different continent.
Yep.
Now, the problems you mentioned are real, social problems, economic, but I do believe the continent has made a huge headway. I do believe even that we could have made further progress if a number of things had been accelerated, which and I can discuss.
Please fill us in on some of those things that have to be worked on if we can accelerate Africa's growth.
I believe if I was to put things in a hierarchy,
okay,
the number one issue for me is the single market of the continent of Africa. How to ensure that the diversity of this great continent is brought to bear in growing the domestic market. So I was a champion when I was in the bank of faster economic integration of the continent. I'm very pleased that the progress has seen some regions, including the East African space. But I would have hoped that many more regions would have made faster progress so that the diversity of this continent can come to bear in terms of creating jobs, opportunities in this new phase of globalization.
You've talked about something like that, and it reminds me of the intra-regional trade. The fact that on the African continent, the intra-regional trade is just at 18%. That was statistics according to 2015, compared to 69% in Europe. Why are we still registering such a low regional trade on the continent?
Yeah, can I nuance this figure though?
Okay.
If you took the regions of Africa one by one, you find a different situation. Here in this region, in Eastern Africa, total trade, regional trade,
yes,
as a percentage of overall trade, is already around 26-27%. Now, that is the same as some parts of Southeast Asia.
Yes.
Now, if you go to regions of Central Africa and North Africa, it is very small, less than 5%. Hence, this global average, which tends to be cited by many authorities. But I do believe we have now the knowledge of what it takes in terms of physical barriers to trade, in terms of institutional barriers, the policy barriers. And I hope and expect that many other regions of Africa will follow the example of East Africa to try to accelerate the progress.
Very good. When you are at the helm of the Africa Development Bank, you seem to push infrastructure so much. It was always at the forefront. But now we decry a status where over 50% of vegetables perish before they reach the market. Is your dream dying? Do you?
Oh, no. Far from it.
Okay.
Far from it.
Then why are we still registering such challenges?
Let me say something to you. Infrastructure is a means to an end.
Sure.
A highway, a rail, is a means to an end. The prize is trade and movement of people and merchandise. And I'm putting to you that in some regions of Africa, that infrastructure is being put to very good use. Now, the point you cite about post-harvest losses is real. In fact, in some regions, it could be as high as 40%. So 40% of the produce is spoiled before it reaches the markets.
Which is very huge.
Precisely. So the emphasis on infrastructure in my tenure at the bank was to try and bring more fluidity to the market, to enable farmers to be able to discover prices more easily, to minimize those losses you're mentioning. And I think of the $28 billion we put in there in infrastructure under my tenure, $12 billion alone was for transport infrastructure.
Okay.
I know now that we've been able to connect most countries to their neighbors. I think that almost every country has now additional investments in infrastructure than in the past. We need to figure out how to find out new forms of financing, and above all, how to preserve the capital in terms of maintenance and cooperation with neighbors.
And if you were to look into probably a few years from now, when do you envisage this could happen? Because when I looked at some of the reasons why even that intra-regional trade is still low, it's because of the dilapidated roads and infrastructure that we still have on the continent. When do you envisage this could be sorted?
Well, in the African Common Position, which the leaders have committed to, I think we all want to be done yesterday.
Yeah.
But I want to put to you that limited trade in some regions is not because of infrastructure. It's not the physical limitations, not the absence of rail or highways. It is man-made policy failures related to what we call non-tariff restrictions.
Okay.
We have made a lot of progress on tariff issues. Tariffs are no longer an issue in many parts of Africa. They've come down fast enough to levels where they should be. But now we need to work on non-tariff restrictions and the free movement of the people. Now, you ask me when that will be?
Yep.
I hope sooner than later. I frankly hope this continent in the next decade has to make faster progress than it has.
What does it take? Because leaders seem to want to build those resilient economies against such challenges, and even the people do want so. What does it take? What are some of the factors that leaders have to put into play?
Well, I think they're being too harsh, though, because
and being too realistic.
The current economic challenges are global.
Yes.
They are global. They go from Russia to Saudi Arabia to Venezuela to Brazil. So all continents are struggling with one form of problem or another.
Sure.
Now here on the continent of Africa, because of our history, because of balkanization, because of where we come from, the direction of travel seems to be longer. But I'm putting it to you that for the last 15 years, not only has the continent turned the corner, it seems even to have built resilience to some of these global shocks, which other countries are finding difficult to cope with. So I agree with you, the glass is half empty, but I prefer to see a glass which is half full.
You know, they've been saying Africa rising is just a rhetoric statement. Countries on the continent continue to reel under unfavorable economic conditions and falling commodity prices on the international market. As an economist, what's your take?
But can you first of all talk about this Africa rising?
Good.
I think you never have heard me, when I was leading the bank, ever
Mention that word.
talking about Africa rising. Because I think Africa rising is at once an imagery similar to one now being advanced the end of Africa's story. Both are wrong.
Yes.
Because economic development does not happen like that. It is not something which happens to people. It is hard work. It takes time. It takes years. And so you asked me about commodities. That is part of the issue.
Yep.
Today's world is no longer dependent on commodities. It is dependent on talent. You import commodities. You employ your talent to produce sophisticated goods which the markets are looking for. And so part of the narrative is to figure out how we go from an economy of extractives, economy of commodities, to one based on talent and knowledge. And I want to believe that many countries are on the right path, and a conference like this is a good position to discuss further these issues.
Truly, they're very good. There are very many positive stories on Africa. We've seen many economies tremendously register various achievements. But Africa is also still troubled with weakening currency rates. Talk about the South African rand, talk about the Ghanaian cedek, talk about the Ugandan shillings, the Tanzanian shillings, and the Kenyan shilling. Why does it seem to prove so hard for Africa to take off? Well,
we have a global situation now where a number of countries, not simply in Africa,
yep,
but across the world, have to make necessary adjustments. I say they go from Saudi Arabia to Venezuela, yep, to Russia to Brazil because of the global evolution. And so there are a group of countries on the African continent who are heavily dependent on oil and mineral products, and therefore the decline in those prices has put pressure on the currencies. Now, what has to be done is known. You have to allow the currencies to adjust. Mm. But there are also many other countries who have benefited from the current situation.
Sure.
Countries like Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, and others have actually seen improvement in their balance of payments because their import bill has declined. Mm. So the picture is nuanced. There are a group of countries, including those you cite, which cannot delay the reforms needed. I think the reforms needed would be mainly on the side of the balance of payments. I think on the fiscal side, they have room to identify additional sources of revenue. They have to reprogram the expenditures. But I do believe for those countries who are now seeing less pressure on their balance of payments, it's the right time to do a number of reforms, especially in the field of social protection, better investment in infrastructure and so on. So don't lump the countries in one category.
Good.
We have countries doing quite well and who are showing a lot of resilience. And we have others who have to make the reforms now. And the more they delay, the more painful it will be.
You've talked about the decline or the slump in oil prices. And there's some African countries that have heavily relied on oil to grow their economies. What does this slump mean to them? And what are some of the measures that they can adopt to compensate for the slump?
Well, it's not simply oil. So it's about copper, it's about cobalt.
Yep. Most
the things we inherit from God.
From God.
The things we don't create. The things we have inherited,
yes,
as Michael Porter puts it. I think for those countries, I like to say that actually behind every cloud, there's silver lining. It is time to make the necessary adjustments. There are rooms for improving the economic base. Shall I give you the case of one large African country where actually when you look at the share of oil in GDP, it's much lower than we thought. Okay. But its share of the revenue is very high. So what has to be done here is not rocket science. It's monetary adjustments. It's identifying additional sources of revenue. Above all, diversifying the economic base. And I do believe that during this crisis, this is a moment when those tough decisions must be taken, and they are known.
Very good. We're going to take a very short break, and we'll be right back. Make sure you send a question or comment on our Twitter handles at Ime Molekatete and at RTV English, and put a hashtag, the big Q, or hashtag WAFE Africa 2016. And I'm very sure Dr. Donald Kaberuka would love to answer that. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back, and I'm glad that you're still watching ARA TV. It's still a special edition of the BQ on World Economic Forum, and I'm still with Dr. Donald Kaberuka, Hauser Senior Fellow at the Harvard University. It's a pleasure. I'm glad that you're here. We're still talking about the oil decline, the slump in the oil prices. And one thing, looking at the slump, not just for oil, but even in other minerals, is it feasible for East African countries, notably Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania, to invest in oil right now?
First of all, can I say that if you look at the African space today, in fact, for the last probably 12 years, the fastest growing region of Africa has been East Africa. Yeah. And that has not been on the basis of oil or minerals. Yeah. It has been in spite of that. Not only has been growth has been steady and continuous, it has been effective in reducing poverty from Ethiopia to Rwanda to Kenya to Uganda to Tanzania. Yeah. So I think these countries have already put in place the fundamentals for continued transformation without depending on oil whenever that comes. Now, I'm sanguine about what to do when you find a natural resource like this. I've just mentioned to you that I think the countries who depend on those products have two problems. One of them is that growth is very volatile. 9% one year, 3% the next day. But more important, it is a kind of growth which is not very effective at reducing poverty. And so I want to believe that East African countries who are now discovering that wealth will do everything they can to maintain the policies which ensure continued resilience in the economy and treat that natural product as a gift from God, but not a miracle for the future. The real miracle for the future is what they have been doing now. Good policies, resilient policies, but above all, policies that matter for the people. So now, your question is, should they invest in oil?
Yes.
Well, the natural resource is there. It is only right that it should be utilized. The business model, the management model of how you manage well an extractive industry are well known. And I'm hoping that those countries will avoid the mistakes which their neighbors or other countries have done.
You've talked about the fact that having oil in a given country, how it doesn't necessarily trickle down poverty levels in a given country. And that reminds me, I think it goes back to inequalities in Africa. We've registered huge inequalities in Africa. Why do you think this has been a persistent record?
Now, inequalities is a global problem now. Latin America, which is the most unequal society, has been battling this for a long time. So I want to begin by mentioning that point. It's a global problem which we have to address. And I also want to note that don't confuse inequality of the type often discussed, that is the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Yes.
It's more about the benefits of growth in the economy at a particular point in time. And this is why I was mentioning to you at the beginning how I'm very happy that in this region you have economic growth, but also declining poverty.
Yep.
Now, that is so important in terms of growing the consumer base, in terms of growing your middle classes. And I would like to see those policies continue. It's politically right, it's socially important, and it's economic must to ensure that the benefits of economic growth are inclusive and they benefit all parts of the country, all genders, all people at the same time. I would like to see countries who are depending on extractives figure out how to use the revenues from the extractive industry to invest in the future,
yes,
to invest in wealth which is created by talent and knowledge, not simply that given by God.
The world is eyeing Africa for investment. As an economist, how do you compare the thrive in Africa's growth to the instabilities, not just talking about security instabilities, but price instabilities, currency instabilities, governance instabilities? How do you compare that?
Well, the way to deal with external shocks or internal shocks is to build the resilience in a system. Now, the way you build resilience is ensuring that A, your macroeconomic policies are consistent.
Yep.
In 2008, during the global financial crisis, many countries in Africa had a lot of resilience, a large amount of reserves, low deficits, fairly sound policies in that space. Now, today, we're less resilient, and we need to begin to build the buffers for dealing with the shocks from outside and from inside. So this one side, macroeconomic policies. Resilience number 2 is about social policy. Social policy meaning that if you have economic growth which generates inequalities, which is not inclusive, at some point is no longer sustainable. So the second element of resilience is to ensure policies that are inclusive. Now, I happen to believe that the third level of resilience for African economies is greater economic spaces brought about economic integration. We cannot control global economic shocks, but we can build resilience, as we have done during the global financial crisis and subsequently.
I understand you're going to appear, or you're going to feature on a panel during World Economic Forum. Now, I go back to the World Economic Forum on the fact that how can Africa rethink education and foster next generation of industry and society leaders, from the fact that by 2030, Africa will host the biggest world workforce?
That is a very exciting question. In Davos, for the World Economic Forum, the theme was what they call the fourth industrial revolution.
Yes.
And now here's why, and I'll come to what it means for Africa and our education systems. The first industrial revolution was built around steam engines, around 1750, 1760. The second one, I think a century later, around mainly electricity, that kind of stuff. And then in the 19th century and the 20th century, a lot of progress on IT and computerization. Now, we're in a phase where science has made huge leaps, whether it's nanotechnology, biotechnology, genetics, and so on, where disruptive forces in the global economy are actually where a good money is flowing to. Look at drones and what they mean for future transport. Yep. Look at robots in medicine. And so the importance of this phase of globalization is that talent will be more important than even capital. And that means nations that build talents, that ensure that the pool of talent increases year after year, are the ones who will reap the benefits of the fourth industrial revolution. Now, for a continent like Africa, where the demographic dynamics are in our favor, it can only mean that we have to re-examine our education system to ensure that that window of opportunity, which opens only once, is taken care of. So it means human resource development, and creating conditions for innovations, creating conditions for entrepreneurship. This is what I'll be saying at that panel. And it is so urgent because Latin America, which had a window around in the 1980s, missed it.
Yep.
Southeast Asia took advantage of this window, what they call the demographic dividend. Now, we are the cusp of that here on the continent. And so at the moment when talent learning becomes more important than what we have under the soil, it means that the way we educate people, the kind of talents we attract, will be the decisive factor.
I know you've talked about the innovation and having a fine-tune in the education system, but like you've been noting, globally, we are still grappling with unemployment levels that are still very high. And some of the young people who we are probably training, especially in roundabout the vocation and training, vocation and technical training, they still highlight or decry the challenge of starting capital. How are we going to be able to remedy this in the presence of unemployment, the education system? Because most of them are already grown up. By the time we change the education system, most of them will be grown up and they will still be suffering with unemployment levels.
It's a good point. Unemployment is a challenge which, again, many countries in the world have to grapple with. Spain had 24% unemployment. Unemployment among the young people in Spain is as high as 30–40%. It's a global issue. Now, I like to look at unemployment from another angle. I like to think about incomes. Because the issue is not being employed. The issue is getting an income which is adequate for yourself and your family. Now, incomes are generated in many ways. And I want to suggest that the formation of talent, the policies that make it possible for talent to develop, for innovation to disrupt things, that is where jobs will be created in the future. So I think that there might be a short-term problem of mismatch between the education you provide and the jobs market of today, which is still based on simple products. But the jobs of tomorrow will be created from the space of learning and talent. So I go back to, yes, we have to look at the way we invest in education and the kind of talent pools that we create.
Very good. But do African leaders know that there is a gap in our education system?
But leaders is all of us. It's you and I.
Yes.
In all sectors of society. I think that we all know that what develops countries is not to have under the soil is the competences which you have. And all leaders are aware of this. In this World Economic Forum, we have more than 89 leaders, I believe.
Yep.
And that is already a sign of the importance they attach to this particular conversation. Now, there may be a gap between policies and implementation, which may be related to capacities, but that is something else we'll have to try and address. But that everyone accepts that the time to invest in the human capital of this continent is now, I think, is generally accepted.
Very good. Just a quick reminder, the special edition of the BQ is live, and you can send your comment or question to Dr. Donald Kaberuka, and it will be answered before we wind down our show. And we're still talking about the education system on our African continent. They've talked about the public-private partnerships. Are we seeing the private sector players also getting onto or pioneering the education for Africa's future?
You know what? I'm a big supporter of an initiative on this continent called the African Leadership University, which we shall be discussing at this forum, which is trying to innovate around the way people are trained for the needs of today. And so my answer to you would be that every country will have to figure out the challenge they face, the opportunities available to them, and then retool their education systems accordingly. Now, the reason I support the ALU is that there's a straight link between training and industry. It is both demand-driven. It is both demand-driven and driven by opportunities coming up in this fourth industrial revolution, as Klaus Schwab likes to call it. Yeah, so it's a good question, and I think that at this forum we'll be having a good conversation on this.
I think that's enough of the sneak peek into what you'll be discussing. We can expect more during the forum, but still about the public-private partnerships. There have been many reports about private sector players dragging their feet in some of the sectors. Why do you think that's the problem?
First of all, you know, PPPs are not a panacea.
Yep.
They're complicated. They're complex to bring about, because far too often, you know, the one party wants to offload most of the risks to the other party. So they take time. But in education, I cannot see the public sector alone providing the means needed for the kind of education we're discussing. There'll be a bigger role for the private sector. There'll be a bigger role for the two to combine together so that you can provide the education which is needed. Now, there are models of how that is being done. And as I'm putting it to you, the African Leadership University is one such model. There's a campus in Mauritius, already up and running. There'll be one here in Rwanda, which shows how when governments and private people work together, we can provide the kind of education we need to provide. But I want to caution that PPPs are not a panacea. They don't provide all the answers we need, whether it is in power, in water, or education.
But they seem to be pushed for so much, especially when reforms are needed in a particular sector.
But also because the public sector means are limited. And there are opportunities for the private sector. So I'm saying to you that we need to come together and find a sweet spot where the interests of the public sector and private sector are saved. But again, without the naivete of thinking this is a panacea.
Very good. Also, something that I would want us to talk about, since this is going to be about connecting Africa's resources through digital transformation, there's been a problem of cyber crimes. And I know it's not just in Africa, but also globally. But now that we are focusing on Africa, how are we expecting that this forum will draw some synergies or some resolutions that are meant to combat the cybercrime in Africa?
You know, all disruptive forces throw up the good and the bad. And so cyber crimes, cybersecurity will demand a lot of international cooperation. It's like other crimes. I mean, whether it is large corporates, whether it is governments, we're all at risk. And so to require a regulatory environment, international cooperation. But I believe the upside of what is happening in the digital space far, far outweighs the downside, like the cyber crimes. But it require regulation, it require cooperation at the international level.
And what are some of the insights we expect to tackle this? The reason why I'm raising it again and again is because it costs Africa. Let me just look at cybercrime costs the global economy roughly $445 million a year, and security experts warn it could be Africa's next big threat. And if not tackled right now, it could be something that would affect us even for a longer period.
But it is not something which Africa can tackle alone.
Yeah, sure.
I'm putting to you that this kind of disruptive forces bring up also new problems, which require a context in which they can be managed. But I don't think we should be scared by those kind of problems to allow this opportunity being created by the digital space to bypass us. I think that would be a big mistake. So we have to manage those threats, the ones you mentioned, and there are others. But much more importantly, try to identify what are the opportunities being thrown up by this new digital revolution. But with international cooperation, I'm convinced that we can manage the threats, including the ones you mentioned in the cyberspace.
As we wind down, what action is needed for Africa to raise competitiveness, especially on the international global market?
Well, you know, it's plain vanilla. There are the basics. Look, I visited a country not long before I left office, where the whole country of 3 million people has only about 58 megawatts of electricity.
Only 50?
8 megawatts of electricity.
Okay.
And they pay about 50 cents per unit. Now, that goes without saying that there's some basics to be in place. Energy, basic infrastructure, and so on. But I said to you at the beginning that these things like infrastructure are a means to an end.
Yep.
An end is more trade, more creation of sophisticated goods, which means that you have to train your people and give them opportunities to take advantage of that. So there are basics, infrastructure. But what changes a nation is the quality, the talent of its people. It's not the roads. You know, Somalia, before 1990, had invested a lot in infrastructure. But now they have to begin all over and figure out what to do. So I think that stability, the basics like infrastructure, getting together in the single markets and embracing the changes which we are discussing here in Kigali this week.
Very good. The BQ is always tries to link leaders with the audience, and it's so sad I had not yet read any question from any of our audience. But I've been reminded by one question from Agaba, Ronald, and he brings some light moment to the whole discussion. If you were 20 or 25 years, what would be your priorities in technology and globalization? Take yourself back in a few years, maybe 35 or 40 years from now.
Oh, you know, technology moves so fast And 20 years for me is a long time ago.
Yep.
You know, when I was born, people were playing music on the gramophone.
Yeah.
Along the way, they are playing music on the cassettes.
Yes. Or even just flash discs.
Along the way, there was, I think, the CD. Now we have other things. 20 years is a long time ago in technology. Things are happening so fast now that I think for any young person who is 20 today, it is to acquire the tools which will enable them to take advantage of the opportunities which science innovation is throwing up. And frankly, the sky is the limit on this issue. Who would have thought of the drones 10 years ago?
Yep.
Who would have thought of the robots in medicine? Who would have thought of the things happening in genetics, in nanotechnology? So I think embracing those opportunities, creating room for them to thrive, is a way to go for people who are in the generation you're mentioning.
Still about technology, since it's anyway the primary theme of the whole forum, internet for all. Is it possible that all people can be connected to internet? Let's start with just East Africa. Is it possible?
It's not only possible, it is necessary.
Okay.
It's not only necessary, it is urgent. Because that's where the knowledge is. All right? So I do think that we need to do everything possible to ensure that there is generalized access to knowledge through that particular channel. And it is not so costly, but I think the returns will be enormous.
If it's not costly, why do we still have about 76% of East Africa's population not connected to the internet?
Okay, but look at the glass which is half full.
Okay.
Look at how far we have come since the 1990s in telecom industry in Africa. This is the fastest growing industry on this continent. So since the deregulation of the 1990s, much has happened in this space. I think all we have to do now is to accelerate the investments needed to ensure that every human being has access to internet. Every
human being?
Absolutely.
And okay, you every time I try to ask you to tell me probably how many years from now, because like you said a few years ago, we were nowhere. And now we have registered some
No,
success.
I don't want to engage in astrology.
Okay.
I want to engage in policy making. How to put in place the tools, the instruments for taking advantage of this new phase of globalization. Now, it should happen as soon as possible. That's what I'm saying to you. We should not have to wait for 10, 20 years for that to happen.
Okay. How can Africa harness the power of innovation that is available right now or in the near future for its economies to grow?
But look at things which have happened already. You know, the famous M-Pesa in Kenya,
yep.
The change which have happened in the financial sector, in how we deliver education, how we deliver services, shows me that the potential for innovation on this continent is quite high. We simply have to provide space for it to happen. We have to provide support for it to come about. But I do believe that we have already made a lot of headway. And this is why I go back to what we have to do now, which is to shift from emphasizing what we have under the ground to what we can put here, create a pool of talents for the new phase of globalization.
Okay, as we wind up, I keep saying as we wind up, I really apologize. I've not been able to read some of the comments and questions you've sent in right now. We need to connect the digital transformation to my iPad, and I hope by next time we'll be able to do so. As we end with this, what does the fourth industrial revolution mean to Africa? It's something that you talked about, and I'm very sure that not only Rwandans, but the entire African populace would love to know. What does it mean to Africa?
Oh, it means quite a lot. Not only does it mean a lot, it is an opportunity for this continent to leapfrog. We don't have to go back to coal, to fossil fuels. We don't have to go back to old systems. Today, a drone. Let me finish. I read somewhere here that Rwanda is trying to use drones to deliver services, health services.
Sure.
Call that innovation. It's fantastic.
Yep.
You don't have to wait to build a 20-kilometer highway to deliver vaccines, medicine to a village. So we have to look at what this new revolution offers, the disruptive forces created, manage the downside, and take advantage of the upside. Now, for Africa, it is exactly what the doctor had ordered. As a latecomer, we don't have to go back to what people are doing in the 17th century, 18th century. We have an opportunity to say, in the learning space, in the knowledge space, all right? That's where we have the future of this continent. And provided we remain a stable space, we invest in people, we invest in the young people. That is exactly the way to take advantage of this new revolution based on disruptive forces in knowledge, which would be more important than capital, as I kept saying to you.
Thank you very much for your time.
My
I'm told
pleasure.
I'm down with all the minutes that we have.
My pleasure.
Yes, thanks a lot for the comments, although I've not been able to read them. But like I said, next time I'll be connected to the digital transformation. But thanks a lot for following on RTV. I'm Ime Mule Katete Kalema. Until next time, I'm wishing you a wonderful night. But do not forget, keep it here at RTV. News will be coming your way with Motesi Teopista. From me, be well and be blessed.